After the popularity of my Donkey Kong Arcade ports video just a few days back, I thought let's do another massive success from what is now referred to as the golden age of arcade, the late 1970s to early 1980s, and what is likely the next biggest thing next to Donkey Kong in terms of popularity. It's Pac-Man, of course, or Pac-Man as it was called in Japan for its 1980 Namco release. For North Americans, you have seen Midway on arcade machine cabinets back then. This was part of the Namco licensing agreement. The popularity of Pac-Man at the time of release was nothing less of astonishing. It surpassed the original 1977 Star Wars film A New Hope in revenue by $1 billion. It was estimated that on its release, the arcades in America was earning around an estimated $8.1 million per week. That's a hell of a lot of money. And remember, this was $8.1 million in 1980. That's just over $30 million per week in today's money. To say that Pac-Man was a successful game is just an understatement. Pac-Man was to arcade as the Beatles were to music. A part of its mass popularity was that it was designed with women in mind too, rather than games that came before it, which was more aimed at a male audience such as Asteroids or Space Invaders. This was a brightly coloured game in comparison, and a bright arcade cabinet to go along with it that young children were also attracted to playing. Talking of which, Asteroids, which was a best-selling arcade game in the late 1970s, this game emerged and totally wiped the floor of it in terms of revenue. Now of course, Pac-Man, amongst most other games of the golden age of arcade, had a staggering amount of clones and hacks. Some were better than the official releases, and some was just very bizarre. This video will be ranking the original run of official releases from the years of 1982 up until 1999. I of course had to stop somewhere, and to me ranking anything post 1999 would be pointless. The idea of these arcade ports videos is to really review the games where hardware limitations were a factor, whereas ranking games of say the Xbox or PlayStation era really isn't much of a challenge. Several of these platforms in this video have had some awesome aftermarket releases over the years, but these of course won't be mentioned. We're specifically looking at the original run of releases. So today we are ranking from the worst to best home conversions of the classic Namco 1980 arcade release of Pac-Man. Now, I will mention that several platforms had several releases by different publishers. For example, the Commodore 64 had a Datasoft and Thunder Mountain release, and the same goes with Apple II. And so, due to the sheer amount of versions released, I will cover one release per platform, generally the first releases. I will only cover Western releases as the Japanese market had versions on the FM7, Sharp X1 and so on. If I was to cover everything, this video would be endless, and there is only so much packing one can do. If you know much about the different arcade home conversions of Pac-Man, then you won't be surprised to see the Atari 2600's 1982 Atari Inc. release as the worst version in this ranking video. Just like the Donkey Kong video, this was also a 2600 game I would play on as a young boy on my mum and dad's Atari 2600. Of course, I thought that this was wonderful at the time. I also thought that the Pac-Man's sticker on the box of their 2600 was cool, as this was actually a packing game for the 2600 at the time. Let's take away nostalgia and look at this version for what it actually is. It's terrible. It is just horrendous. Let's begin with the bad things then. Of course, this isn't a centralized or even vertical looking game. It is a full screen affair, but in its defense, many versions, home conversions that is, were pretty much in this format. We have no introduction to the game, but to be fair, this was normally the case for Atari 2600 games. We have no music here, just some really bizarre noise as the game starts. Collecting the dots sound awful. Talking about dots, these don't even look like dots. In fact, some of these are actually joined together. We have flickering ghosts rather than the 4 different colours. I am not sure if these flicker because of bad programming or flickering to give a ghost effect. Either way, they look terrible. After finishing the second stage, we get no Pac-Man animation like the arcade game had. It's not good, it's just diabolical. And to think I once played this with one of those original Atari red button joysticks, which was stiff enough anyways. Regardless of how bad this version was, it still managed to sell over 7 million copies in its day. IBM PC compatible users were treated to a version of Pac-Man in 1983, again by AtariSoft. Now it goes without saying that the colours used here are wrong, but that was strictly down to how IBM computers were in the early 1980s, so to some degree the colours can be excused, but the noise this version makes is pretty shocking. It does however have the ghost eyes travelling to the centre of the gameplay screen once bumping into them after using a power pellet. This version is fairly clunky to play and it isn't particularly smooth to play by any means. Not sure if it was just me, but the maze design here just seemed different to most versions and just seemed bigger than it had to be. Pac-Man's dying animation was pretty good and it did have a nice presentation when the game loaded up, but yeah, not really a great conversion at all. The Commodore VIC-20 received its Pac-Man port in 1983, again by AtariSoft. Although comparing this with the pitiful Atari 2600 version, then this is leap years ahead. But it isn't a great game by any means. Firstly, it seems that starting the game, Pac-Man will automatically move to the left, which is very annoying, as many times the ghost will be straight onto you as the centre is just above. Controlling this version seems very clunky too, and there is a fair issue here with frame drops. It just clunks along. The main issue here is that the maze is small. Pac-Man and the ghost seem way too big for it. It just doesn't look right. I also found that eating power pellets will seldom work when bumping into ghosts. It seems that in this version, being invisible against these ghosts only works when it wants to work, which I found myself dying a lot here. We do have a fairly faithful opening tune to the game, but the sound effects are pretty noisy to be fair. Also, when bumping into ghosts after eating a power pellet, we get no eyes which travel to the centre of the maze. We also get no cutscene after level 2. Yep, definitely not a great version which has a fair amount of sprite flickering too. The ZX Spectrum had a release by AtariSoft in 1984. This was released to work with the 16K Spectrum machines. Now, as you can see, this is a very scaled down version. Sprites look very small here, but acceptable to some extent. The game is very choppy to play and it feels it too, especially when too much is happening at once. We don't get a vertical central look here, but apart from those issues, then this really isn't much of a bad port if I'm honest. The 4 ghosts here are actually coloured differently from one another. We get a fairly decent introduction tune before the game starts. Sound effects are fairly good too. The controls are a little wonky admittedly, but I think this is due to the fact that it doesn't run too smoothly. The maze is presented fairly nice here considering, and the colours are nice. We have no colour clash here either, and that is simply because Pac-Man only had black backgrounds in the arcade version, with Pac-Man being yellow too. So in terms of messy Spectrum colour clash, that's not the case here. When collecting power pellets and eating ghosts, the eyes that travel back to the centre of the gameplay area is nicely done here. What really surprised me with this version is we had a cutscene after finishing the second level, which even had music to go with it. But generally, I rank this one so low down in this list because it's a very scaled down version in terms of sprites, and it does lag a fair amount. Although we have a nice attempt for the arcade maze layout with this 1983 release by AtariSoft for the Apple II, this is really where it stops. The text on the left hand side, which details your score, is a mixture of orange, blue and white, and it looks fairly messy. The gameplay itself, although it is scaled down a touch, but certainly bigger than the Micro Machines version for the Spectrum, isn't that bad. Sure, the ghosts here are bizarre colours, but they do have their own colour representing their character names in the game. They do look very chunky admittedly, but the scrolling here is actually fairly good in comparison to other versions where it was undeniably choppy. Yes, it's not perfect, but we are heading in the right direction in that department. The music for the introduction to the game isn't the greatest, but a nice little touch added is the eyes that travel to the centre of the gameplay area. Yes, they aren't detailed with pupils etc, but these 2 white pixels travelling look pretty good here. Next up, we have the Texas Instruments, or just TI-99, Atari Soft 1983 release. Now, by far, this is one of the slowest versions of Pac-Man on any other platform in this video. It's really slow, and getting through a level seems to take quite some time. Even when we die, instead of a millisecond to load up the play again, this leaves us with a black screen, which takes a few seconds longer than any other version in this video. It's a real shame because this version looks the part, to the extent that eyes travelling to the centre screen are actually done correctly, where they have pupils and not just a couple of pixels. The colours used are nice and bright, and the maze layout is very nicely done. It's really not a bad looking version at all, and it's very responsive to control. It really is just being let down by that slow pace. We do get a level introduction theme to it too. Although it's not the best sounding version, it's still something. The Atari computers had a version of Pac-Man 2. It reminded me a little bit of the ZX Spectrum's version in terms of being scaled down, although this version wasn't as bad and played better. It's a fairly speedy game of Pac-Man 2. It controls well enough and not too bad to play for people who enjoy the faster version of Pac-Man. I must say though that the opening of the game looked very ugly. I really thought this version was going to be worse than what it actually was. It's another full screen game and nothing really stands out as a real full version of this game. It sounds acceptable enough, but I am sure kids in 1983 when this version released would have been fairly happy with it. Released in 1983 by Atari Soft, the Commodore 64 had a version of Pac-Man. Is this a good version for the official Pac-Man release? Let's just say that it was a very bare bones game without adding fancy bits and pieces like cutscenes between levels, with Pac-Man chasing after ghosts as they scroll across the screen. The opening music isn't the best of the SID chip, but again, at this early stage in the C64's life, programmers were still learning how to make the best of the SID chip sing. It is a fairly slow paced version of the game. We get the eyes which travel through the maze after hitting the ghost, which is similar look to the Apple II's release. The maze sizing and sprite size are fairly good here, and not overly pixelated either, or even rough around the edges as some versions have had. It's not a perfect version of the game at all, but we are getting there. I think if this version followed in the Apple II's vertical centralized look, this could have been much better visually to look at. We do at least have 4 different colours though for the ghosts, even if they are slightly duller in colour. It was fairly difficult placing this Game Boy 1990 release by Namco. On one hand, it is a nice little game. On the other hand, it wasn't that good. I will say that a game like Pac-Man isn't best suited for a scrolling screen whilst in gameplay. Obviously, as this portable system only had a 2.5-inch screen, it was likely coded like this in order to give players bigger looking gameplay in terms of the maze and sprite sizes. One slight issue is that when exiting the maze from the left or right, because we cannot see what is on the other side of the screen when we re-enter the gameplay area, we could easily get caught by a ghost that is waiting there for you. We do have an option at the start screen to change it into a full screen mode, and as much better as this is playing it in 2025 on a full screen where the image is bigger, playing this originally would have been microscopic. The stupid thing is that the default scrolling screen has a rectangular block on the right hand side to display its scores. This could have been removed to give us an overall better look. The music and sound effects are excellent, and this also features a nice animation after level 2 is finished. Of course, we also need to take into account its monochrome display too. Having said that, this is a highly polished game and it looks like a quality release too, to be fair. In 1999, the Game Boy Color got a version of Pac-Man, also released by Namco. This was pretty much an upgraded and obviously coloured re-release of the Game Boy game. in that it is the same game, only here we have another Pac-Man game built in called Pac-Panic. Other regions, extra game was titled Pac-Attack. So this version obviously got higher ranking as it is in colour, and we still have the option to see the full gameplay screen, which likely would have been easier to see if you played this on the Game Boy Color originally. If you had an original Game Boy back in the day like myself, you'll remember how hellish screen blurring was and having to find the correct lighting conditions to play this in. We did have add-ons like clip-on magnifying glass and so on, but that's besides the point. I think Game Boy's version of Pac-Man wasn't really too well thought out. The Mattel Intellivision's release of Pac-Man, released in 1983 by AtariSoft. This was actually a very good version for the old 1979 home console. Sure, the maze isn't 100% perfect here, as this is a fairly small layout, but it does have a good match for the arcade game in terms of the blue walls used. This shade of blue looks fairly close to what it is going for. The ghosts are all the same colour here, -1, which is actually a light purple here rather than the light turquoise colour in the arcade game. We get cutscenes in this version too, which are all nicely done. The ghost eyes look really nice here too as they travel to the central point of the gameplay area. It's running at a fair pace too with no frame drops, and sprite flickering isn't an issue here. This is also nice to control and feels very fluid too. The introduction music is superb and the sound effects are very much like what it is copying. After the disastrous Atari 2600 release, Atari released a much superior version for its upgraded console in 1983, which was for the Atari 5200, or known as the Atari 5200 Super System. This console was considered a flop after being discontinued in less than 2 years of its initial release. But it did have a great version of Pac-Man, and for those who upgraded from the 2600 would have been super impressed with this release at the time. This version is pure quality and glides along with ease regardless of how much is happening on the screen at any one time. It's a very colourful version, and the colours of the ghosts are looking more like the colours used originally in the arcade game. The only odd one out here is the green ghost, but we still have it green, just a different shade of green. The opening music is very similar to the Intellivision's port, which sounds excellent. The siren sounds and the sound effects for collecting dots here sounds really well done. Not to the high-pitched sound which the arcade game gave us, but really well done, and this is a nice home conversion. Of course, this takes on the full screen look rather than the vertical look, but it's still a decent version. I highly recommend checking this one out. It goes without saying that the Sega Game Gear had a massively superior screen than the original Game Boy, and arguably better than the Game Boy Color screen too. Kids had a 3.2-inch screen to play with for this 1991 release of Pac-Man, and it's much better to play too for this. Sure, it is a scrolling version, but the scrolling here doesn't obscure important parts of the gameplay areas where we exit and re-emerge from either left or right of the maze. This was a fantastic version of Pac-Man both visually and musically. Again, just like the Game Boy and Sega Game Gear releases, this was obviously a portable edition of Pac-Man for the Neo Geo Pocket Color. This version was leap years ahead. The Neo Geo Pocket Color had a screen of 2.7 inches and a screen that was brighter to see and a little more clear too compared to the say Sega Game Gear. Although the screen was smaller than the Game Gears, the conversion here was nicer to play, and of course this handheld screen was more of a vertical style screen compared to the Game Gear's full screen display. Although it does scroll to reach the bottom or lower parts of the maze, it is clear to see, and exiting and re-emerging through opposite sides of the game doesn't leave you in the dark by not knowing if ghosts are waiting for you. It sounds decent, and it is likely at this point in history this was the best portable version of Pac-Man around. This one released in 1999 by Namco. If you don't like how this version scrolls, we also have an option with this version to give us a full screen mode too. So for a couple of honourable mentions before we reach number 1, Amstrad did have a game which was initially known as Pac-Man, but due to copyright issues, the name was changed to Snapper. This released in 1982 by Acornsoft. It's not a bad 8-bit computer version of the game, but features no cutscenes. I would have easily said this was better than the Spectrum's version. The ColecoVision did have a release lined up, but it was actually never officially released. This is the prototype. As you can see, this was a solid looking going to be released, and likely the best looking version of that generation too. It sounds great and the sound effects are perfect here. The eye animations are superb here. When ghosts regenerate in the center box, they look awesome as they regenerate pixel by pixel. A real shame this one was never to be. And in first place, I have decided to put the 1987's Tengen release of Pac-Man here for the Nintendo Entertainment System. I think this is the best in presentation and quality. This looks very much like a quality and premium game for this system compared with other versions in this video. The game isn't centralized in the middle of the screen, that is, but it is displayed with a vertical look rather than the full screen that many platforms ended up with. The colour of the ghosts here are all the same -1, and it happens to be the green ghost. It is very likely that this system did not have a colour on the palette as of the same shade as the arcade game itself. Remember, systems of the 1980s were limited with colours, especially 8-bit systems like the NES. This version is smooth to play and suffers absolutely no frame drops whilst playing it. The music and sound effects are likely as close to the arcade original as this could get. Most versions could not quite reach the high tones of that tune. The eyes in this version look awesome. They kind of leave a slight blur behind them as they are whizzing back to the centre of the maze. The few colours that are used here are bright and vibrant. When power pellets make the ghosts change colours, the NES does this extremely well as they flash. The opening to the game even looks awesome as the Pac-Man logo scrolls upwards. And that is it for today's ranking all the various ports of Pac-Man. Right now I'm utterly packed out and there's going to be no more Pac-Man for me for a while. So which version did you play as a kid? Did you agree with the NES version being in the first place? And as I said at the beginning of this video, if you watched the introduction all the way through, I did mention that each one of these platforms in this video had several different versions, such as the Nintendo NES. But by covering everything, I would have lasted a lifetime more than likely doing this. But anyways, as always, comment in the comment section and let us know which version you grew up with and if you would have ranked NES in first place. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.